is Sven Beckert, and I'm a historian teaching at Harvard University, and I'm currently a fellow at the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies. My work principally focuses on the history of capitalism and is an effort to understand from a new perspective the global history of this powerful way of organizing economic activities during the past 500 years. As you know, we all live in a capitalist world, and capitalism affects all aspects of our lives. Ironically, what seems natural to us, what is all around us, is sometimes what is most difficult to understand because it almost seems like the air that we breathe. As a historian, I'm trying to make what seems normal and what seems natural, I'm trying to make that seem strange again. And that is, in a nutshell, the core of the project that I'm currently working on, namely telling the 500 years of the history of capitalism from the perspective of a distant future. My work is guided in doing so by three basic questions. The first one is, how did capitalism emerge? Why did it emerge when it did emerge? And why did it emerge in the places that it did emerge? The second question is, how did capitalism change over time? And the third question is, what are the characteristics of that capitalism throughout time and in various parts of the world? Of course, as you know, many have studied these questions, and indeed it is perhaps one of the best studied sets of questions in the social sciences in the past 200 years. However, from the vantage point of the 2020s, from our own vantage points of today, I believe we can develop a fresh new way of thinking about the powerful capitalist civilization in which we live. And I principally try to do so in a number of ways. For one, I'm trying to overcome the Eurocentric perspectives on the history of capitalism. The history of capitalism, how we think about the history of capitalism, how we write the history of capitalism, is still one of the most Eurocentric narratives that we tell. And it is Eurocentric across the entire political spectrum. This is, I believe, a complete misreading of the history of capitalism, and it is untenable in a world in which the most rapidly growing economies are to be found in Asia. So my first approach is to try to overcome a Eurocentric perspective on capitalism. My second approach is to not only tell the history of capitalism as a global history, but also I find that it is impossible to understand capitalism without focusing on the global, because in many ways capitalism itself was a production of the new kinds of global connections that came about starting in the 15th century. The third set of approaches to this problem and the third set of arguments in my project is that the interconnectivity of different systems of labor, different territorial regimes, and different political systems throughout the world is one of the fundamental characteristics and defining characteristics of capitalism. The capitalism, in many ways, is what I call a connected diversity. And some of the reasons why capitalism has been so dynamic and so long-lasting is that capitalism, unlike many of the people who have studied this, is rather undogmatic. Then I'm also trying to write an actor-centric history. It is not a history just of impersonal huge processes, but it is also a history of merchants, of workers, of peasants, and of other actors. And these actors are being studied in all different parts of the world. I'm looking at merchants in 16th century India, at industrial workers in 20th century Dakar. I'm looking at steel industrialists in 20th century Germany, and at peasant revolutionaries, enslaved revolutionaries in Saint-Domingue. So a whole range of actors. In the process, I very much emphasize the importance of the countryside to the history of capitalism, and I'm very interested in the role of the state. Indeed, I find that capitalism can only be understood as a co-production that very strongly involves the expanding scale and scope of the state. I'm trying to overcome also the deep ideological divisions that have characterized our views of capitalism that were prominent during the Cold War years. And again, we find ourselves now in a post-Cold War moment, and thus I believe we can look at capitalism again with fresh eyes. But first and foremost, the project aims to denaturalize capitalism, a particular and even peculiar economic form of organizing economic life was made by human agency, by all kinds of actors in all parts of the world. And in this way, the book and the project emphasizes human possibility and our ability as a human community to shape our future and not to see ourselves to be victims of a system that is allegedly natural and beyond human control. This is obviously a very, very large project, and it poses just as many questions as it answers. Because it does advocate for a different perspective on the history of capitalism, because it does advocate for a non-Eurocentric perspective, it, for example, raises a lot of questions about things such as African economic life or merchant communities in India and China. And thus, by the end of this project, I expect to have more questions than I had at the beginning.